we are in a bit of a box in human resources right now, and surprising because in many ways we should be sort of on top of the world. One of the things that might surprise you, always surprise HR people, in the 1950s when corporate executives were asked to rank the most glamorous function in business, what do you think was the top one? You can't bring yourself to say human resources, can you? I tossed it up like a little softball for you, and you can't hit. It was human resources. You might wonder, how is that possible? Because they are the people who decided who went to Paris for an assignment and who went to Sheboygan. Apologies to anybody from Sheboygan. They were called the chess masters. They used to move people around the world, and they had all the power, right? It's a situation now where you would think we would be way more powerful, but we're not. We want to talk about how to get out of that box and go back to making the case as to why we should be able to be more advocates for employees, something we used to do but don't do so much now. You know, if you look like at the conference board surveys of CEO issues, talent has been on the top of that thing for so long they're ready to retire it, right? And on most of these corporate surveys, it's always number one or number two issues. You would love in any other function to be the number one or two issue that CEOs have, but that doesn't give you power unless you can address and solve those issues, right? So that's what we want to talk about, and the big takeaway is these days it should be the case that just being able to hire good people, develop them internally, and keep them, talent management stuff, should put us right in the important part of the organization. We got to figure out how to get back to that, okay? Let me tell you just a little of the historical context, something that you probably know but probably haven't thought about. If we have baby boomers in the room in particular, you remember trying to get a job in the late 70s or particularly early 80s. It was really, really difficult. And the reason for that is that unemployment, if you went back to the 1973 from 1973 to 2017, the unemployment rate in the US fell below 4% only 1 year. Since 2018, it has been at or below 4% every single year. That is an enormous structural change. One of the problems that's caused is that before 2018, we had two generations of managers who only knew a buyer's market for talent, right? And now it's not. And even though the layoffs right now are helping, so that's the only good thing. You can say, by the way, go back and tell your CEO, boss, I've solved our turnover problem. Just tell them that, but they won't ask why. And you have, right? Because the layoffs now have frozen everybody. Quit rates are dropping like crazy. Nobody wants to move when there's uncertainty, and we got lots and lots of uncertainty, right? So that's the big story, is that we've had this enormous change in the labor market. And we have moved toward a model where talent is really a strategic priority. The leaders have changed as well, and this is not a good thing, right? If you think about who the corporate leaders are now, there are a lot of them tech people who never managed anything before. They never had management training. They became entrepreneurs in a context where things were just really perfect to take off. I have a colleague named Bill Barnett, at Stanford, and following up on a point that Ann made, sometimes C teams are okay. He looked at the starting companies in the dot-com period, okay? And he found that every single one of them made a ton of money. It wasn't because every leader was smart, and it wasn't because every team was great. Sometimes you have such enormous opportunities that pretty much everybody's going to make it. That was largely true in the tech world. But now our role models are tech guys who never managed anything and frankly probably couldn't manage their way out of a tin can, particularly the current one who's got the most power, right? Doesn't seem to understand much of anything about people, right? So what is different now? In addition to the fact we've moved to the seller's market, a couple of things which suggest this is not going away. The first is the labor force in the US is no longer growing by much. It's not shrinking, but it is really, really slowed down. By the way, in every industrial country in the world, other than the US, it's declined, right? Here's the other thing we don't notice so much, don't talk about. Productivity has lagged. Productivity growth in 2010, in that decade, was the lowest level in US history. Now, why does that matter? If you want to double the size of your company and you've got no productivity growth, you got to double your workforce, right? And in a country, if you've got no productivity growth, you've got to double. If you want GMP to grow by 10%, you got to grow your workforce by 10%. Productivity is hugely important, and it has not kept up with historical levels. So that means more pressure on hiring, right? So this is why I think this current issue of tight labor markets is probably not going away. It's a long-term problem. Look at this list, but you folks, I think here, I4 folks have probably got their own surveys on this. This just happened to be Gartner's. But look at what they say HR folks are worried about. The number one issue is when they say leader management development, the bullet underneath that is we don't know how to help our managers deal with all this stress and problems and overwork. Okay? The second issue is organization culture. The problem they say there is managers are ignoring the whole idea. We can't get them to pay attention to it. Workforce planning, this is not going to be easy to solve. The problem with workforce planning is unless your business can plan, your workforce plan can't work either, right? But change management, we're going to come back to the problem of constant restructuring we're doing now. And workforce technology, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's the issue of AI, and it doesn't seem to be helping us yet, right? So those are the problems they're worried about, but let me back up a little further. Here's why HR has got a particular problem, and it starts with financial accounting, which are the rules and the scorecard that investors use to decide who's winning and who's losing. Right? There are a lot of quirky things about financial accounting that I never knew about. One of the things my father absolutely wanted me to take was an accounting class. One of the things I never did was take an accounting class. However, I had to learn a lot about it this last year, and here are some things which might surprise you. If you look at financial accounting, they see no value in human capital at all. So if you were to ask an accountant to value the Philadelphia Eagles, did I mention we won the Super Bowl? Did I mention that yet? And you value them, the players, the team, the city of Philadelphia would say, well, look at these great players we've got, and they're all under contract. Accountant would say, no value there. Why not? Well, because you can only have something as an asset if you own it. To be an asset, you have to own it. Human capital, you don't own those people, therefore, they're no value. There's no asset value to human capital. Right? Even if they're under contract to you. Training, let's talk about training. We talk about it as an investment. Can't be an investment for financial accountants because you can only invest in an asset, right? That means training falls under financial accounting along with coffee expenses and often furniture, right? And so it just looks like you're wasting money to the investors if you're spending money on training. It can't be an investment. We think it is. We treat it that way. Normal people would, but not financial accountants, and they set the rules for how investors think, right? One other quirky thing that this explains, well, you remember the unlimited vacation thing that has been going around, right? You know why we're really doing that? It's got nothing to do, of course, with helping employees. It's because if you move to unlimited vacation, you move away from accrued vacation time, and that takes those costs off your balance sheet. So suddenly your liabilities go down and your company is instantly more valuable. That's why it's happening, right? Why do we have so many leased employees in the US? It's not about flexibility. It is because performance in finance is measured on a per employee basis, not a per worker basis. So if I can cut my head count and bring in other people to do that work, even if they cost more, and they typically do, my financial performance suddenly looks greater because I've cut the denominator, right? There's all kinds of these things like it which describe and explain some of the quirkiness about how we're handling human resources, particularly in public companies. Now think about it this way. Suppose employees had asset value, okay? And you announced the layoff. Think about how stupid that would sound, right? Suppose you had a group of computers that were collectively worth $1 million, but you decided you're going to get you're going to replace them. And they ask you, what are you going to do with them? And you said, we're just going to put them out on the sidewalk. They would say, what are you, nuts? But if we talk about employees who have asset value, and we say, we're just pushing them out the door, they would say, what are you, nuts? That's crazy. So the fact that we don't treat employees financially as assets changes the way we think, and it contributes to a lot of the craziness, things that just don't seem to make sense about the way we manage right now, right? So here are the two troubling issues I think we're all kind of dealing with. The first one is this relentless budget squeeze. If you think about it, at least until a few weeks ago, right? The US economy was chugging along nicely. The stock market was going up to historic levels. The unemployment rate was 4% or below. Everything looked great, and yet suddenly we are laying off employees and squeezing our budgets. How many of you have heard this? Our big priority is to do more with less. Why? Well, because the economy's booming and the labor market's tight, so we got to lay people off. Doesn't make any sense, right? It was driven by investor pressure, first squeezing the tech companies, and then the other boards of directors and CEOs look around and they say, well, they're cutting. I think we better cut as well. So that's what's happening there. How are we going to deal with that issue for our own employees? I'll come back to in a second. The other issue is this relentless push to try to expand AI. If this is true for you too, just raise your hand a little bit and we'll see. But I was talking to some HR people who told me they had quotas given to them by their CEO for the amount of AI they were supposed to introduce. Anybody else got that or heard that? Well, the reason, why do you think the CEO is interested in that? Because they think AI is going to allow them to cut headcount cheaply. That's why they like it. So let me tell you a little story about this, just briefly, but it's in the Harvard Business Review. We have a little piece there about it a month or two ago. We followed a company that tried to automate a very simple task. By the way, there's 1 million reports about AI, but none of them actually tell you an example where stuff happened. They're just talking about what people think will happen, but they're not actually showing you what happened. Anyway, here's what they did. It was claims processing in insurance. Here's the simple task. Envelopes come in, you got to open them up, figure out what's inside. Is it a claim? Is it an appeal? Is it some evidence? You got to put it into categories. Pretty simple task. After that, you got to get the data out of that sheet of paper and onto your own system. They had 44 people doing it at this one location, right? Opening, sorting, copying the numbers over. So the company said, this is not sustainable for us. Turnover's high. Quality of the work's not great. We need to automate this, okay? We can't get enough people in to do this kind of work, at least at the wages we want to pay, okay? So they went to AI, and they had a bunch of people working on this, and they found a particular piece of AI software that could do this. They said, yay, and it seemed to work pretty well. Then they discovered that it costs far more to do it with AI than with employees. We always think AI is cheap because we're using ChatGPT that's free, but the good stuff is not free. These companies are not in the business of giving stuff away, right? So what do they do then? Well, let me cut to the chase. They had a team of 6 people, expensive consultants and data science people, working on this for a year. They spent $500,000 up front to Amazon, AWS to get consulting help. At the end of this process, they found a way of layering cheap AI and then more expensive AI, but they're paying $200,000 a month to these AI companies for that going forward. They cut their headcount from 44 people to 41 people, right? Now, in fairness, they have also taken on more work, and so each employee per person is now far more valuable. But here's the punchline. It wasn't cheap. It's expensive. And their conclusion was, if you're going to automate something, it's got to be something expensive or it won't make sense in terms of a return on the assets, return on investment rather, right? And they still needed employees around because there was stuff that the AI can't do. Can't read this handwriting. There's missing data here. Somebody's got to go get it off the forms. So it didn't cut headcount by as much as they thought. Time-consuming, really expensive, right? Okay, so what's the response been? How are we managing people now? These are just embarrassing statistics, right? So let me show you a couple of these. 1/3 of US managers say they never got any training on being a manager before they were made a manager. kind of astonishing, right? There's this ADP study at the bottom left here that they found that when they looked at people who were promoted in the US, make sure I get this right, almost 30% quit within a month. We just promoted our employees, so they must be good ones. They're gone in a month. Why are they gone, you think? You know the expression of dry promotion? You know what that is? Dry promotion is you promote people, but you don't pay them anymore. Because somebody thinks it's a good idea. They say, well, we'll save money this way, right? Because we give them a promotion, later we'll come back and raise their pay. That will be great unless you knew anything about labor markets and you know you've suddenly made these folks much more valuable in the outside labor market than they are to you, and poof, suddenly they leave, right? So you can look at these sort of statistics here. This is just not looking like a place where we really are paying any attention to the fact that it is kind of a seller's market now, right? And we're burning through employees. These two little strikes last year at Kaiser Permanente and CVS, you know what those strikes were about? They're trying to get management to fill the vacancies that they had for a while. Why are they not filling them? Because somebody thinks it saves money to keep them open, right? But they're burning through our employees. Mental health issues but stress is a huge issue right now. And these layoffs that are percolating through the system are driving private sector employees crazy as well, right? Because they think it's coming to them, and maybe they're right. Where are our business leaders on this? They seem to be largely clueless. Look at this first one here, a study that Metropolitan Insurance has done every year. And they found that 83% of the top executives thought their employees were financially healthy. When they asked their own employees, no, they're not, right? They just don't seem to have a very good sense of what's going on. My contact with these folks is I've been going to a McKinsey event twice a year or so, where you're meeting with the CEO, some CEOs, CFOs and things. They have no idea about any of these things. So I spoke to 3 CFO groups last year. They had no idea that turnover costs you real money. They have no idea. They're basically treating it like it's free, right? If you think turnover doesn't cost you anything, most of your human resource practices just seem irrelevant to you, which is the way it seems to them, right? So that's the problem. And this is kind of a slow-moving train wreck, what we've got right now. Here's the punchline of this, of course, not too surprising. That is, we need to get evidence to the CEO whose job it is to balance these issues. The CFO, it's not the CFO's job, right? It's the CEO's job to think, okay, we got the employee issues over here, we got the investor issues over here, how do we strike a balance? Well, they need to know the real costs of these things. If you think turnover costs you $4,000 a person, you think differently about it than if you think it's $40,000, right? Even the CFO thinks about it differently. We've already got a lot of these measures, including things like what does stress cost us? So my colleague Jeff Pfeffer a couple of years ago wrote a book called Dying for a Paycheck, just documenting what it costs you as an employer when your employees get stressed out and get sick from it, right? What are the insurance costs from that? The folks at the top of the house, at least my sense, have no good idea about this, right? And here's one more thing to worry about, and this is agile, right? Do you remember the little swirly documents here, or diagrams here? It's not that kind of agile anymore. No, we're past that one. That agile was about project management. Now when we say agile, we mean continuous restructuring, right? And I bet your CEO is talking about this as well. 3/4 of the business leaders say this is a top priority to be agile, which means continuous restructuring. Now, if you're an employee, continuous restructuring means continuous psychiatric medications, right? Because it completely stresses you out. One of the things you might not know is that companies announce layoffs, they never do. Why would you do that? Because they think investors like to see it. And they say, you know, in 3 years we're going to cut this many people, and then they don't do it. The problem is, they might say, great, we never did it. The employees don't know that, and they're freaked out for the next 3 years waiting for these layoffs to come, right? This problem of change fatigue is an interesting survey that found that employees' willingness to get behind new initiatives is dropping, right? And corporate restructuring doesn't seem to work very well, right? So we have all the problems I've just described, and now we've got this continuous restructuring issue that executives seem to think is the way forward. So what are our options here? Well, there are some things we can do. One is to tone down the fake restructuring, and that is to try to persuade the CEOs what happens internally when they announce one of these restructuring plans, right? As a head of human resources told me, the first thing that happens is I have a line of executives outside my door wanting to find out what's going to happen to them. Let's talk about the severance payments and all that stuff, right? It stresses out the organization, and then they can't get their work done, right? Could we rebuild the internal labor market as a way of trying to get the right people in the right job internally without having to go outside? So my colleague Matthew Bidwell did a very important study a few years ago comparing people who were promoted to a position versus people who were hired from the outside into the same title, okay? What he found, people who were promoted from outside, it took them 3 years to catch up to the performance of the people promoted from within, and it took the people promoted from within 7 years to catch up to the pay of people hired from the outside. So we're paying the outsiders a ton more. It takes them much longer to get productivity. This is costing us a lot more money. Why are we doing that? You know, the figure now in the US is that we are filling only about 23% of our vacancies from within. That figure a couple of generations ago was 90%. Right? It's astonishing change. So our last thought here about what we have to do. We have to get numbers in front of the CEO and get them there fast. Now, this is not a new claim, right? Human resource accounting, for some of you folks who are older, you remember that from a couple generations ago, 2 generations ago, of people. It's not a new claim, but there's a lot of evidence now that we need to get in front of them, and we can. How much does it cost to leave vacancies open, unfilled? We know about this. There's articles in finance journals talking about these problems, right? What is the benefit of promoting from within? This is costing us real money, folks, right? This is not a claim about how to be nice to your employees, because that would be a good thing to do. This is a claim about this is hurting your business and our financial performance because we're blowing money by hiring from the outside all the time. We're blowing money with these dry promotions. And not paying people when we promote them, they just leave. We're blowing money by keeping vacancies unfilled. You think it's saving money, but work is not getting done, and you can see it in the financial performance of the companies afterwards, right? So that's the story, right? We're in a bit of a box right now, despite the fact that the CEOs are saying talent is our big issue. Hiring is our big issue. Filling vacancies is our big issue, right? The problem is they don't see what it is costing them when they don't do that well. So we want to try to make the case that, you know what, finding good people, hiring them, filling vacancies from within, keeping those folks, that is a strategic imperative, right? We don't have to do anything else fancy to justify that what we are doing is super important for the organization. The problem right now, I think, is the CEOs understand the problem. They don't see that what we're doing solves it, right? And so this is kind of a marketing problem for us. We have a couple of minutes left. I spoke faster than I thought, I think. So if you have a question, we got a couple of microphones in the room someplace. Up here, there's others. And if you got a question or you want to shout at me about Elon Musk or something, that's perfectly fine too. We got a minute or two for questions if anybody's got any. So we'll take just a second here and see what's happening with that. It's a shy group, clearly. I don't know if people are getting up to talk or leave. If you're leaving, not so good. While you're getting up, I will say a couple of other things about AI, but we got a question first. Please, yeah.
Hey, Peter, I'm the head of research at I4CP, and I'm really curious, when you gave those talks to the groups of CFOs, and everyone's clearly aware of the data point, hey, talent's our big issue from CEOs, et cetera. But what are they seeing as the financial impact? What can HR leaders do to close that gap for the CFOs and the CEOs, right, to really understand that, other than just present metrics? Or maybe it's the metrics they're not they don't
Well,
have, but if you could talk
yeah,
to that.
yeah, great question. So I was presenting the kind of things that you folks probably all know, and that is, what does turnover actually cost when somebody quits? What does it cost, and what's involved in trying to replace them? What does the evidence show when you leave positions vacant? What happens? And my sense was they had no idea about any of those things, that they had never heard this, right? So it's not like, we've got to convince them of something they don't believe so much. They just have no idea what these things cost. I mean, they're living in their own planet. And what they like, of course, is cutting headcount for the reasons we described earlier. Those things are hard to counter, right? I mean, we may think it's stupid, and by the way, there is an effort in front of the Security Exchange Commission now, it's out for comment, that's put forward by the investor world, where they want to know more about human capital. They want companies to be forced to report turnover rates. How much are you spending on training, right? Tell us something about your development, your internal development. They want the SEC to make companies report that. If they had to report that tomorrow, that would change our world in a heartbeat, right? The problem is accountants don't want to do it because FAP, that controls GAAP, is a board that is accountable to nobody except the accounting profession. And believe me, because I wrote an article about this, they really, really are upset with the idea that anything might tamper with GAAP. They see it as like the Bible, So they don't want to do it, and the employers, the corporate heads, they don't want to report anything else, thank you very much. But the investors are pushing for it because they say, look, most companies are service companies now. We look at a tech company, we try to evaluate what it's worth. All they got is people. We always say that. But it turns out the investors know it's a problem. How do we value this? Because we look at the accounting books, it doesn't show anything here, and yet this company's revenues are $1 billion a year. How could that be? They want to know. And they're pushing to find out. So let's hope, in this case, that the investors win. I rarely ever cheer for investors. But here's a case where it really is probably a good thing. Folks, I think we are now out of time. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And off we go.